Hey guys, we're back, and I really debated because I wanted to do this with you guys in class, but we have a lot more work, a lot more great writing projects to do before we can finish out our work on this novel. So, what I'm going to do today, are you ready for this? Is I am going to finish reading our book. Yeah, we are actually almost done with our book, A Long Walk to Water. We have about 3 chapters left. And so I'm going to read those chapters and let you guys think about the story. And we'll come back tomorrow and talk about how the story ends, what you expected, and think about what we need to do with the story in the coming next 2 weeks or so. So without further ado, let's go over to our book and start reading. If you're with me yesterday, we finished off as Salva takes his first steps into a new life in America. But of course, we want to go back and see what Naya's up to. So let's go with chapter 16, Southern Sudan, 2009, and see what Naya is doing as they work on building a well. After the excitement of seeing that first spray of water, the villagers went back to work. Several men gathered in front of Naya's house. They had tools with them, hoes and spades and scythes. Her father went out to meet them. The men walked together to a spot beyond the second big tree and began clearing the land. Naya watched them for a few moments. Her father saw her and waved. She put the plastic can down and ran over to him. "Papa, what are you doing?" "Clearing the land, here. Getting ready to build." "To build what?" Naya's father smiled. "Can't you guess?" Now, can you guess what they're getting ready to build? Rochester, New York, 1996 to 2003. Pay attention to those dates. We're really moving ahead in time here. 1996 to 2003. Salva had been in Rochester for nearly a month and still had not seen a single dirt road. Unlike Southern Sudan, it seemed that here in America, every road was paved. Excuse me. At times, the cars whizzed by so fast he was amazed that anyone on foot could cross safely. His new father, Chris, told him that dirt roads did exist out in the countryside, but there were none in Salva's new neighborhood. All the buildings had electricity. There were white people everywhere. Snow fell from the sky for hours at a time and then stayed on the ground for days. Sometimes it would start to melt during the day, but before it all disappeared, more snow would fall. Salva's new mother, Louise, told him it would probably be April, 3 more months before the snow went away completely. The first several weeks of Salva's new life were so bewildering that he was grateful for his studies. His lessons, especially English, gave him something to concentrate on, a way to block out the confusion for an hour or 2 at a time. His new family helped too. All of them were kind to him, patiently explaining the millions of things he had to learn. It had taken 4 days for Salva to travel home from the Ifo refugee camp in his new home in New York. There were times when he could hardly believe he was still on the same planet. Now that Salva was learning more than a few simple words, he found the English language quite confusing, like the letters O-U-G-H, rough, though, fought, through, bow. The same letters were pronounced so many different ways. Or how a word had to be changed depending on the sentence. You said chickens when you meant the living birds that walked and squawked and laid eggs, but it was chicken with no S when it was on your plate ready to be eaten. Or having chicken for dinner. That was correct, even if you had cooked 100 chickens. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever be able to speak and read English well. But slowly, with hours of hard work over the months and years, his English improved. Remembering Michael, Salva also joined a volleyball team. It was fun playing volleyball just as it had been at the camp. Setting and spiking the ball were the same in any language. Salva had been in Rochester for more than 6 years now. He was going to college and had decided to study business. He had a vague idea that he would like to return to Sudan someday to help the people who lived there. Sometimes that seemed like an impossible notion. In his homeland, there was so much war and destruction, poverty, disease, and starvation, so many problems that had not been solved by governments or rich people or big aid organizations. What could he possibly do to help? Salva thought about this question a lot, but no answer came to him. One evening, at the end of a long day of study, Salva sat down at the family computer and opened his email. He was surprised to see a message from a cousin of his, someone he barely knew. The cousin was working for a relief agency in Zimbabwe. Salva clicked open the message. His eyes read the words, but at first his brain could not comprehend them. United Nations Clinic. Your father. Stomach surgery. Salva read the words again and again. Then he jumped to his feet and ran through the house to find Chris and Luis. "My father," he shouted. "They have found my father." After several exchanges of emails, Salva learned that the cousin had not actually seen or spoken to his father. The clinic where his father was recovering was in a remote part of southern Sudan. There was no telephone or mail service, no way of communicating with the clinic's staff. The staff kept lists of all the patients they treated. These lists were submitted to the United Nations aid agencies. Salva's cousin worked for one of the agencies, and he had seen the name of Salva's father on a list. Salva immediately began planning to travel to Sudan. But with the war still raging, it was very difficult to make the arrangements. He had to get permits, fill out dozens of forms, and organize plane flights and car transport in a region where there were no airports or roads. Salva, and Chris and Luis as well, spent hours on the phone to various agencies and offices. It took not days or weeks, but months before all the plans were in place. And there was no way to get a message to the hospital. At times, Salva felt almost frantic at the delays and the frustrations. What if my father leaves the hospital without telling anyone where he is going? What if I get there too late? I will never be able to find him again. At last, all the forms were filled out and all the paperwork was in order. Salva flew in a jet to New York City, another one to Amsterdam, and a third to Kampala in Uganda. In Kampala, it took him 2 days to get through customs and immigration before he could board a smaller plane to go to Juba in southern Sudan. Then he rode in a jeep on dusty dirt roads into the bush. How familiar everything was, and yet how different. The unpaved roads, the scrubby bushes and trees, the huts roofed with sticks bound together. Everything was just as Salva had remembered, as if he had only left yesterday. At the same time, the memories of his life in Sudan were very distant. How could memories feel so close and yet so far away at the same time? After many hours of jolting and bumping along the roads in the jeep, after nearly a week of exhausting travel, Salva entered the shanty that served as a recovery room at the makeshift hospital. A white woman stood to greet him. "Hello," he said. "I am looking for a patient named Mawin Dut Arik." Chapter 17. Southern Sudan, now 2009. "What do you think we are building here?" Naya's father asked, smiling. "A house?" Naya guessed. "Or a barn?" Her father shook his head. "Something better," he said. "A school." Naya's eyes widened. The nearest school was half a day's walk from their home. Naya knew this because Deb had wanted to go there, but it was too far. "A school?" she echoed. "Yes," he replied. "With the well here, no one will have to go to the pond anymore, so all the children will be able to go to school." Naya stared at her father. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. When at last she was able to speak, it was only a whisper. "All the children, Papa? The girls, too?" Her father's smile grew broader. "Yes, Naya, girls too. Now go and fetch water for us." He returned to his work, scything the long grass. Naya went back and picked up the plastic can. She felt as if she were flying. School! She would learn to read and write. Sudan and Rochester, New York, 2003 to 2007. Salva stood at the front of one of the beds in the crowded clinic. "Hello," he said. "Hello," the patient replied politely. "I have come to visit you," Salva said. "To visit me?" The man frowned. "But who are you?" "You are Mawin Dut Arik, aren't you?" "Yes, that is my name." Salva smiled, his insides trembling. Even though his father looked older now, Salva had recognized him right away. But it was as if his eyes needed help from his ears. He needed to hear his father's words to believe he was real. "I am your son. I am Salva." The man looked at Salva and shook his head. "No, it is not possible." "Yes," Salva said. "It's me, father." He moved to the side of the bed. Mawin Dut reached out and touched the arm of this tall stranger beside him. "Salva," he whispered. "Can it really be you?" Salva waited. Mawin Dut stared for a long moment. Then he cried out, "Salva, my son, my son!" His body shaking with sobs of joy, he reached up to hug Salva tightly. It had been almost 19 years since they had last seen each other. Mawin Dut sprinkled water on his son's head, the Dinka way of blessing someone who is lost and is found again. "Everyone was sure you were dead," Mawin Dut said. "The village wanted to kill a cow for you." That was how Salva's people mourned the death of a loved one. "I would not let them," his father said. "I never gave up hope that you were still alive somewhere." And my mother?" Salva asked, barely daring to hope. His father smiled. "She is back in the village." Salva wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. "I must see her." But his father shook his head. "There is still war near Lunarik, my son. If you went there, both sides would try to force you to fight with them. You must not go." There was so much to talk about. His father told Salva that his sisters were with his mother, but of his 3 brothers, only Ring had survived the war. Arik, the oldest, and Kual, the youngest, were both dead. Little Kual. Salva closed his eyes for a few moments, trying to picture his brothers through a haze of time and grief. He learned more about his father's illness. Years of drinking contaminated water had left Mawin Dut's entire digestive system riddled with guinea worms. Sick and weak, he had walked almost 300 miles to come to this clinic and was barely alive by the time he finally arrived. Salva and his father had several days together, but all too soon it was time for Salva to return to America. His father would be leaving the clinic shortly as well. The surgery he had undergone had been successful, and he would soon be strong enough to make the long walk home. "I will come to the village," Salva promised, "and as soon as it is safe." "We will be there waiting for you," his father promised in turn. Salva pressed his face tightly against his father's as they hugged goodbye, their tears flowing and blending together. On the plane back to the United States, Salva replayed in his mind every moment of his visit with his father. He felt again the coolness on his brow when his father had sprinkled the water blessing on him. And an idea came to him. An idea of what he might be able to do to help the people of Sudan. Could he do it? It would take so much work. Perhaps it would be too difficult, but how would he know unless he tried? Back in Rochester, Salva began working on his idea. There were, it seemed, 1,000,000 problems to be solved. He needed a lot of help. Chris and Louise gave him many suggestions. Scott, a friend of theirs, was an expert in setting up projects like the one Salva had in mind. He and Salva worked together for hours and days, which grew into weeks and months. Along the way, Salva met other people who wanted to help. He was grateful to all of them, but even with their help, it was much more work than he had imagined. Salva had to raise more money for the project, and there was only one way to do this. He would have to talk to people and ask them to give money. The first time Salva spoke in front of an audience was in a school cafeteria. About 100 people had come to hear him. There was a microphone at the front of the room. Salva's knees were shaking as he walked to the mic. He knew that his English was still not very good. What if he made mistakes in pronunciation? What if the audience couldn't understand him? But he had to do it. If he didn't talk about the project, no one would learn about it. No one would donate money, and he would never be able to make it work. Salva spoke into the microphone. Hello? At that moment, something went wrong with the sound system. The speakers behind him let out a dreadful screech. Salva jumped and almost dropped the mic. His hand trembling, he looked out at the audience. People were smiling or chuckling. A few of the children were holding their ears. They all looked very friendly, and seeing the children made him remember. It was not the first time he had spoken in front of a large group of people. Years before, When he was leading those boys on their walk from the Ethiopian refugee camp to the one in Kenya, he had called a meeting every morning and evening. The boys would line up facing him, and he would talk to them about their plans. All those eyes looking at him, but every face interested in what he had to say. It was the same here. The audience had come to the school cafeteria because they wanted to hear him. Thinking of that made him feel a little better, and he spoke into the mic again. "Hello," he repeated, and this time only his voice came from the speakers. He smiled in relief and went on. "I am here to talk to you about a project for Southern Sudan." A year passed, then 2, then 3. Salva spoke to hundreds of people, in churches, at civic organizations, and schools. Would he ever be able to turn his idea into a reality? Whenever he found himself losing hope, Salva would take a deep breath and think of his uncle's words. A step at a time. One problem at a time. Just figure out this one problem. Day by day, solving one problem at a time, Salva moved toward his goal. Chapter 18. Southern Sudan, 2009. Naya waited her turn in line. She was holding a plastic bottle. The well was finally finished. The gravel had been put down to make a foundation. The pump had been installed, and the cement had been poured and left to dry. Before the pump was used for the first time, the villagers all gathered around. The leader of the workers brought out a big sign made of blue canvas. The canvas had writing on it. The writing was in English, but the leader spoke to Naya's uncle, and Uncle told everyone what the sign said. "In honor of Elm Street School," Uncle said. "This is the name of a school in America. The students at the school raised the money for this well to be dug." Uncle held up one end of the sign. The workers' leader held up the other end. Everyone else stood around it, and one of the workers took their picture. The picture would be sent to the American school so the students there could see the well and the people who were now using it. Then the villagers all got in line to wait their turn for water from the new well. When Naya reached the head of the line, she smiled shyly at her uncle, who paused in his work for a moment to smile back at her. Then he began moving the pump handle up and down, up and down. A stream of water flowed from the mouth of the pump. Naya held her bottle underneath the pump mouth. The bottle filled up quickly. She stepped aside to let the next person fill a bottle. Then she drank. The water was delicious. It wasn't warm or muddy like the water from the pond. It was cool and clear. Naya stopped drinking and held up the bottle so she could look at it. Funny that something without any color at all could look so nice. She drank a few more sips, then glanced around. Everyone had a bottle or a cup. They were drinking that lovely water, or waiting in line for more, or talking and laughing. It was a celebration. An old granddad standing not far from Naya shook his head. In a loud voice, he said, "This is where we used to gather for our bonfire celebrations. I have been sitting on this ground my whole life. In all those years, I have never knew that I was sitting on top of this good water." Everyone around him laughed. Naya laughed too. In a few more days, the school would be finished. Naya and Dep and Akir would all go to school, along with the other children. Next year, there would be a marketplace where the villagers could sell and buy vegetables and chickens and other goods. There was even talk of a clinic someday, a medical clinic, so they wouldn't have to walk so far to get help as they had to when Akir was ill. It was the well that was bringing the village all these good things. But the well was not for their use alone. People would come from miles around to fetch the good, clean water. Naya knew from listening to the grown-ups that the crew leader had made many arrangements concerning the well. No one was ever to be refused water. Some of the villagers would be responsible for maintaining the well. They would be busy with this new work, so the entire village was to help them with their crops and cattle. Other villagers, including Naya's uncle, would resolve any disputes that arose. The well would change their lives in many ways. "I will never again have to walk to the pond for water," Naya thought. She wandered around a little bit, sipping at her cool, fresh drink. Then she caught sight of the crew leader. He was standing by himself, leaning against one of the trucks and watching her uncle work the pump. Dep saw her looking at the man. "That man, the boss of the workers," Dep said. "You know he is Dinka." Naya looked at Depp in astonishment. The Dinka and the Nuer did not look very different physically. You had to look at the scar patterns on people's faces to tell the tribes apart. Dinka scar patterns were different from those of the Nuer. But the crew leader had no scars on his face. Naya had heard some of the teenage boys talking about that, wondering why he had no scars when clearly he was a grown man. The leader's assistant was Nuer. So were most of the crew. They all had Nuer scars. Naya hadn't thought about it much, but she realized now she had always assumed the leader was Nuer too. The Dinka and the Nuer were enemies, had been for hundreds of years. Why would a Dinka bring water to us, she wondered aloud. I heard Uncle and Father talking about him, Depp said. He has drilled many wells for his own people. This year, he decided to drill for the Nuer as well. Depp had not really answered Naya's question. He probably doesn't know the answer, she thought. But now Naya felt there was something she had to do. She walked over to where the man was standing. He didn't notice her at first, so she waited quietly. Then he saw her. Hello, he said. Shyness flooded through Naya. For a moment, she didn't think she would be able to speak. She looked down at the ground, then at the stream of water still flowing from the pump mouth. And she found her voice. Thank you, she said, and looked up at him bravely. Thank you for bringing the water. The man smiled. What is your name? He asked. I am Naya. I am happy to meet you, Naya, he said. My name is Salva. And that's the end of the book. We'll read the addendum at the end, the message from Salva Dude. But I wanted you to think about that, enjoy the book, and kind of the twist ending there. Maybe some of you saw it coming. But when I read it, I didn't see it coming at first. I have a few questions for you that are on Google Classroom. Please get started on those, and we'll look through them again tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Have a great afternoon.